Yesterday was May 9, 2026. Friedrich Merz stood before the cameras in Stockholm and delivered statements that would have seemed almost unimaginable just 10 days earlier. He said that NATO's strength does not depend solely on troop numbers, but also on shared objectives, and according to him, that unity still exists. Shortly afterward, he added that he had no doubt the United States had a major interest in maintaining a strong European branch of NATO at its side, and vice versa. This is the same chancellor who, less than 2 weeks earlier, had publicly criticized Washington in the middle of an ongoing conflict. And that contradiction is exactly the core of what we need to discuss today. To understand what this sudden shift really means, it is necessary to first examine the starting point. At the end of April, during a school visit in the Sauerland region, Merz made an assessment that within hours developed into a serious foreign policy burden. He stated that the deadlocked situation in the Iran conflict had emerged because the Iranians appeared stronger than expected and because the Americans lacked a truly convincing strategy in the negotiations. He expressed the decisive sentence this way: "An entire nation is being humiliated by the Iranian leadership." This was not a neutral assessment delivered from diplomatic distance. It was a direct public evaluation of American war management, voiced by a chancellor whose country remains structurally dependent on the United States in several critical areas. The reaction from Washington came in less than 24 hours. Donald Trump wrote on his platform Truth Social that Merz apparently did not know what he was talking about. He seemed to believe it was acceptable for Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. Then came the sentence that attracted particular attention in Berlin. Trump said it was no surprise Germany was doing so poorly, economically and otherwise. This was not a factual reply, it was a political positioning, and it carried immediate consequences. On May 1, the US Department of Defense formally initiated plans to withdraw around 5,000 of the approximately 39,000 American troops stationed in Germany within 6 to 12 months. The Pentagon stated that the decision followed a comprehensive review of force positioning in Europe and reflected current operational requirements. A diplomatic formulation, yet the timing was anything but accidental. A few days later, Trump escalated the matter further and suggested that the withdrawal could extend far beyond the originally mentioned 5,000 troops. Germany, with roughly 39,000 stationed American soldiers, serves as the largest US military hub in Europe. And for the first time in decades, that status came under serious pressure. What can be observed in Stockholm today can be interpreted in two ways. Either this represents a genuine strategic realignment by the Chancellor, a retreat after an escalation Berlin underestimated, or it is an attempt to project stability publicly while intense efforts are taking place behind closed doors to contain the damage. Both interpretations remain possible. What can clearly be said is that the tone has changed, and in diplomacy, the tone is often the real message. This opening raises an important question. How did things reach this point, and what interests are actually at stake? To understand the full significance of the current developments, one must look closely at the concrete numbers and structures involved. Around 39,000 US troops are currently stationed in Germany. This represents the highest concentration of American military forces anywhere in Europe. This presence is not simply a leftover relic of the Cold War that no one pays attention to anymore. It is an active and fully functioning network with global reach. The Ramstein Air Base in Rhineland-Palatinate is considered the most important US military airfield in Europe. Operations are coordinated from there, drones are controlled, and intelligence is consolidated. The military hospital in Landstuhl is the largest U.S. military medical facility outside the United States. It serves as a central treatment hub for wounded soldiers from around the world. Meanwhile, Africa Command in Stuttgart oversees all U.S. military operations across the African continent. These structures cannot simply be relocated. They are deeply rooted in Germany, infrastructurally, logistically, and operationally. This is a decisive point often overlooked in the current debate. A complete or even large-scale American withdrawal would not only weaken Germany, it would also significantly reduce the global operational capability of the United States. Without Ramstein, without Landstuhl, without Stuttgart, the American military presence in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East would become substantially less effective. Washington understands this as well, and for that reason, the announced withdrawal of 5,000 troops is very likely not merely an operational step, but a signal. Yet even if it is a signal, that signal carries real economic and security consequences. Publicly available data shows that the Ramstein base alone contributes more than $2 billion annually to the regional economy through salaries, rental income, and contracts awarded to local businesses. Mayors from the region point out that cities such as Pirmasens and Zweibrücken have still not fully recovered from the last major American troop withdrawal in the 1990s. These are not abstract figures. They involve landlords, skilled trades businesses, families, and municipal budgets directly affected by these developments. Germany also provides annual financial support of around 100 million euros for the stationing of US troops, in addition to free use of military properties. On the security policy level, another issue has moved into the spotlight. Under former US President Joe Biden, the previous German government had agreed that beginning in 2026, the United States would station precision missiles with a range of 2,500 kilometers in Mainz. In addition, the hypersonic weapon Dark Eagle was supposed to be deployed as an additional deterrence instrument against Russia. Both projects now appear unlikely to proceed under Trump. Military experts are already speaking of an emerging capability gap in the deterrence of Russia, a gap that European resources could only close after significant delays. This is the structural framework within which Merz today speaks optimistically in Stockholm about shared goals. The contrast between rhetoric and reality is difficult to ignore. Also noteworthy is the international response to the announced troop withdrawal. Several leading European media outlets describe the decision as a shock for Germany and as a clear sign of deteriorating bilateral relations. In Arab and Asian media, the Pentagon's announcement made front-page headlines. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte attempted to mediate and acknowledged that there had been a certain level of disappointment on the American side regarding European behavior in the Iran conflict. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas stated that the timing of the announcement surprised her. Even within Trump's own party, according to several reports, concerns exist regarding the scale of the planned withdrawal. This suggests that the decision has not been without internal opposition. If one examines the events of the past 2 weeks objectively, a central question emerges. Was Merz's original criticism of the US strategy toward Iran a calculated foreign policy move, or was it a mistake driven by domestic political pressure? The answer to that question has immediate implications for how his current change of course in Stockholm should be interpreted. The argument for domestic political pressure is supported by several factors. Merz has been under significant pressure at home for weeks. According to available polling data, roughly 3/4 of the population are dissatisfied with his performance. Coalition partners are increasingly raising difficult questions. Campaign promises concerning the economy, migration, and social reforms have either not been fulfilled or only partially implemented. In such a situation, a chancellor may use foreign policy visibility as a form of compensation. One delivers a strong statement and positions oneself as someone willing to speak uncomfortable truths. The calculation is simple. Domestically, one gains attention, while internationally, the risks appear limited. However, this calculation overlooked one important variable, namely Trump's actual willingness to respond to public criticism with concrete measures. On the other hand, the argument for a more fundamental foreign policy misjudgment is supported by the fact that Merz showed strategic caution in earlier disputes, such as the conflict over tariffs in 2025 and the tensions surrounding Greenland. He understood that Trump held the stronger position as long as Europe remained structurally dependent on the United States for its defense. So why did he act differently this time? One possible explanation is that the Iran conflict carries a moral dimension absent from other disputes. The public criticism may have been less of a strategic maneuver and more of a genuine assessment, delivered at the wrong moment, in the wrong setting, and without sufficient diplomatic preparation. This is where the situation becomes more complicated, because there is also a counter-argument that receives too little attention in the German debate. One could argue that Merz was not fundamentally wrong. Several European foreign policy officials have reportedly expressed similar views behind closed doors. The real issue was never whether the criticism itself was justified, but whether a chancellor in such a dependent position has the right to express it publicly in that manner. That is a crucial distinction. Anyone who relies on the security guarantees of a partner must weigh public comments on that partner's strategy with particular care. This is not a matter of submission, but of strategic rationality. The opposition is using the moment exactly as expected. The phrase, diplomatic kneeling before Washington, is now circulating widely. Politically, that reaction is understandable, but analytically, it falls short, because a true capitulation would mean that Merz abandoned his substantive position. So far, he has not done that. In Stockholm, he emphasized NATO unity, but he did not withdraw his statements regarding the Iran conflict. That is an important distinction. He is attempting to do two things at the same time: soften the tone while maintaining his core position. Whether that strategy succeeds remains an open question. Another aspect frequently overlooked in media coverage is that the withdrawal is also controversial on the American side. Even within the Republican Party, there are voices warning against an excessive retreat from Europe. The strategic interests of the United States in maintaining a strong European presence through Ramstein, Landstuhl, and Stuttgart are real and designed for the long term. Temporary political tensions may overshadow these interests, but they cannot permanently replace them. This is likely the real foundation on which Merz is relying in Stockholm, namely, the belief that shared strategic interests are stronger than the current dispute. The coming months will determine whether that assumption holds true. What we are currently witnessing is not an isolated bilateral issue between Berlin and Washington. It is a symptom of a deeper structural shift that has been developing for years and is now becoming more visible through the Iran conflict. Since its founding, NATO has been built upon an implicit agreement. The United States provides the security guarantee, while Europe contributes stability, political legitimacy, and increasingly financial support as well. That agreement is now being renegotiated, not through a formal framework, but through a series of individual decisions, signals, and tensions, whose overall meaning only becomes clear over time. Germany occupies a unique position in this process. No other EU country hosts a comparable concentration of US military infrastructure on its territory. This makes Germany, on one hand, an indispensable partner, and on the other hand, a particularly exposed actor whenever transatlantic relations come under pressure. The current situation illustrates this dilemma very clearly. Germany benefits enormously from the American presence economically, strategically, and in terms of security policy, while simultaneously remaining vulnerable if that presence is used as leverage. Publicly available data indicates that Europe will have to significantly increase its defense contributions in the coming years, regardless of how relations with Washington develop. Germany has now reached NATO's 2% spending target, and there are political signals suggesting that this share may continue to rise. Yet money alone does not solve the problem. What is missing are capabilities that cannot be replaced quickly: intelligence capacities, long-range precision weapons, and integrated command structures. That is precisely where the real capability gap lies, created by the announced withdrawal and the cancellation of the planned deployment of precision missiles in Mainz. There are three plausible scenarios for further developments. The first is that the current tensions prove temporary. Merz's personal signals from Stockholm are noticed in Washington, bilateral talks intensify, and the withdrawal remains limited to the announced 5,000 troops, or is perhaps even partially reversed. In that scenario, the crisis would become a painful but ultimately productive catalyst for clarifying mutual expectations. The second scenario is that Trump maintains his current course, the withdrawal expands, and Germany faces a security policy realignment that it can hardly manage domestically, at least not under the present coalition structure. The third scenario is the most complicated. The withdrawal is formally implemented, but strategically important bases such as Ramstein, Landstuhl, and Stuttgart remain untouched because the United States still requires them for its own operations. In that case, the withdrawal would represent a compromise, a political signal that does not affect the operational foundations of the American presence. Which of these scenarios ultimately emerges depends on factors that still cannot be fully assessed today. These include further developments in the Iran conflict, the domestic stability of the Merz coalition, and whether diplomatic channels can successfully establish a direct line of communication between Berlin and Washington that functions beyond public escalation. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is visibly working toward that goal. Whether it will be enough remains uncertain. What became visible in Stockholm today was a chancellor weighing the costs of his public positioning while attempting to project stability without completely abandoning his underlying stance. That is not an easy balance to maintain. And one question remains unresolved, extending far beyond the current dispute. How much foreign policy independence can Germany truly afford within a security architecture that still relies structurally on American guarantees? This is not only a question for Merz, it is a question for Europe as a whole.